In November 1969, a 24-year-old Air Force captain was stripped of his dog tags, his uniform, and his name. He was handed a fake driver's license, a pair of blue jeans, and a USAID identification card. He was told that if his plane went down, he was not a soldier. He was nobody. There was no Geneva Convention protection waiting for him. There was no record he ever existed. He was about to fly into a war the United States government would not even admit was happening. This is the story of the Ravens. By 1962, the United States had a problem. North Vietnam was running troops and supplies straight through the neighboring kingdom of Laos, down a corridor that would become known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But Laos was supposed to be neutral. That summer, the United States and North Vietnam had both signed the Geneva Accords, promising to keep foreign troops out of the country entirely. North Vietnam ignored that promise within months. America, bound by the same treaty it expected its enemy to honor, found itself unable to respond openly. So it didn't respond openly, it responded in secret. President Kennedy authorized covert air operations in Laos, all of it run not by the regular Air Force but largely by the CIA. It would become the largest paramilitary operation the CIA had ever conducted, and almost no one back home would know it existed. The man the CIA built this war around was a Hmong tribal leader named Vang Pao. The Hmong were highland farmers, ethnic outsiders looked down on by lowland Laotians, living in the mountains that happened to sit directly across the enemy's supply routes. Vang Pao turned villagers into a guerrilla army. But an army on the ground in jungle and karst mountains needed eyes in the sky, someone to find enemy trucks and troop columns hidden under triple canopy, and call in American jets to hit them. That job had a name, Forward Air Controller, and in Laos, Forward Air Controllers needed a cover story, because officially, the United States Air Force was not there at all. The program that recruited them was called the Steve Canyon Program, named, almost as a joke, after a square-jawed comic strip pilot. Air Force pilots already serving as forward air controllers in South Vietnam would be quietly approached, usually around the halfway point of their tour. The conversation was always vague. There's a special mission available, if you want it. They wouldn't say where, they wouldn't say what. Volunteers had to already have at least 4 months of combat duty, 60 days as a FAC, and a minimum of 750 flight hours. Those who said yes were flown to the American Embassy in Vientiane, Laos's capital, and there, something unusual happened. They were stripped of their military identification. Their uniforms were taken, they were issued civilian clothes, sometimes blue jeans and t-shirts, sometimes cowboy hats, and given USAID identification cards that claimed they were development workers. The Air Force called this process being sheep-dipped. They kept paying these men, they kept their personnel files, but operationally the Air Force had no control over them at all. By presidential directive, the American ambassador in Laos controlled every U.S. military action in the country. The pilots reported to the embassy's air attaché, not to any general. Between 1966 and 1973, roughly 200 men carried the call sign Raven. At any given time, there were never more than about 22 of them in the country. They flew out of 5 Lao towns, Vientiane, Luang Prabang, Pak Se, Savannakhet, and the most important of them all, a secret mountain base called Long Tieng. Long Tieng does not appear on any 1968 map. It was so classified that even some American servicemen fighting elsewhere in Southeast Asia never learned it existed. One historian later described pilots who served the entire war without knowing the place was real. At its peak, it held roughly 40,000 people, Hmong soldiers, refugees, Thai mercenaries, CIA officers, and the Ravens, and its single airstrip handled as many as 900 takeoffs and landings a day, making it briefly one of the busiest airports on Earth. The CIA called it Lima Site 20 Alternate. It was for years arguably the most secret place in the world. What the Ravens actually flew should tell you everything about how the Air Force valued their lives. The O-1 Bird Dog was a single-engine, unarmed propeller plane built for artillery spotting in Korea 15 years earlier. It had no weapons beyond white phosphorus marking rockets and whatever sidearm the pilot carried personally. Top speed barely 115 miles an hour. The Ravens flew these planes low and slow over some of the most heavily defended anti-aircraft positions in the world, often skimming treetops to visually locate enemy trucks and gun emplacements before radioing in American jets to do the actual killing. One Raven, Alan Poe, put it bluntly years later, "In Vietnam," he said, "you were a combatant under the Geneva Convention. In Laos," he said, "we were flying basically as soldiers of fortune with a bounty on their heads." Communist forces in Laos understood exactly what the slow, circling planes overhead meant. Bombs were coming next. Enemy agents in Vientiane reportedly photographed Ravens the moment they arrived in the country. Captured documents later showed reward circulars offering up to $25,000 for a Raven taken alive. If a fighter jet went down, there would always be another fighter jet. If the man marking the target went down, the strike died with him. So the enemy stopped trying to shoot down the fast movers and started hunting the slow ones circling underneath them. The casualty numbers reflect exactly that calculation. Of the roughly 191 to 198 men who flew as Ravens, at least 31 were killed. In a unit that rarely numbered more than 22 pilots at once, that is a staggering loss rate, one of the highest of any American unit in the entire Indochina War. And if you were shot down in Laos, in civilian clothes, with no dog tags, no ID, and a loud driver's license in your pocket, there was no expectation of capture and release. Pilots joked about it darkly among themselves. What do we tell them if we get shot down? The answer, half a joke, half not. Tell them you're a forest ranger. The Ravens did not fight this war alone. Their closest counterparts were Hmong pilots, flying American T-28 trainers converted into makeshift fighter bombers, men with no formal flight school background at all, farmers and school teachers 6 months removed from a desk. The greatest of them was a man named Li Lu. Before the war, he had been an elementary school teacher in the village of Lat Hong, one of only a handful of Hmong men in the entire country with any formal education. In 1967, when General Vang Pao asked for volunteers to train as fighter pilots, Li Lu stepped forward. 6 months later, he was flying combat missions, and he never stopped. At his peak, Li Lu averaged 120 combat sorties a month. Some days he flew 10 missions. Over roughly 2 years, he flew more than 5,000 combat sorties total, a number that dwarfed what any American pilot would fly in a full tour. Ravens who watched him work described a man who strafed enemy positions from 20 feet off the ground, so close that he sometimes returned to base with blood on his propeller blades. His motto, repeated by the men who flew alongside him, was simple: fly till you die. He reportedly told people, "They'll never get me. I'm too good." On July 12, 1969, Li Lu was flying home toward Long Tieng when General Vang Pao radioed him directly. Government forces were collapsing under attack near a town called Muang Soi. Lu's plane was already armed. Vang Pao asked him to divert and hit the enemy positions one more time. He turned his T-28 toward the fight. Anti-aircraft fire found him over Muang Soi. His plane went down in the mountains near a village called Ban Po Pyong Noi. He was 34 years old, and he had just bought the dress uniform for a promotion to major that he would never live to wear. When Vang Pao spoke about it decades later, in 2006, he said simply that Li Lu's death was among the few in his life he had cried over. All Royal Lao air power in the region was grounded for 3 days while the country buried him. The Americans felt it too. Li Lu was, by the open admission of seasoned U.S. pilots who flew alongside him, possibly the single best combat pilot in the entire Laos theater, regardless of nationality. He had no formal military training, no officer's commission when he started, nothing but 6 months in a cockpit, and a willingness to fly closer to the guns than anyone else dared. And almost no one outside a small circle of CIA officers and Air Force pilots would ever hear his name because the war he died in officially did not exist. That was the defining cruelty of the secret war in Laos. It killed men, American and Hmong alike, at a horrifying rate, and then erased the record of how. The Ravens flew without recognition, without medals presented in public ceremonies, without their families fully understanding for years what their sons had actually been doing in Southeast Asia. Some Ravens routinely logged well over 100 hours of combat flying a month, an exhausting, grinding pace, in planes with no armor, against anti-aircraft guns that grew more numerous, and more accurate as the war dragged on. Engine failures alone became so common in the rugged terrain that 18 were recorded in a single quarter of 1968. One pilot, Karl Polifka, reported 26 engine failures across the unit in a single month the following year. The Air Force kept paying these men and kept their service records. It simply never publicly acknowledged what those records described. When the United States finally withdrew from Southeast Asia, the war in Laos collapsed with it. Long Tieng, the secret city that once held 40,000 people and ran 900 flights a day, fell in 1975. The Hmong, who had fought and died alongside the Ravens for a decade, were left to face a communist government that had openly promised, in its own newspapers, to destroy them down to the last root. Tens of thousands fled into the jungle, then into refugee camps in Thailand, then, for some, into resettlement in the United States, where most Americans had never heard the word Hmong and had no idea what the price of that alliance had been. No parade ever marched for the Ravens. No public ceremony explained to the country what 22 pilots at a time had been doing flying unarmed planes over a country America swore it wasn't fighting in. They went to war with no rank, no name, and no acknowledgement that the war was happening at all, and the man widely considered the single greatest pilot of that secret war never wore the uniform of any nation's air force. He died in borrowed armament over a country that even now most people couldn't find on a map, flying till he died, exactly like he said he would. If you want to understand more of what America hid from itself during Vietnam, there's a video on screen right now that goes deeper. And if this story made you feel something, subscribe. There are more stories like this one that the history books left out.